Welcome to Baker Briefing, where we make news make sense. I'm David Satterfield, Director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas. In 2025, the global need for humanitarian aid has never been greater. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs estimates that across the globe, 305 million people will require urgent humanitarian assistance, 4 times the number from just 10 years ago. At the same time, major sources of this critical aid are pulling back, including the United States, which dismantled the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, in early 2025 and cut nearly $8 billion in funding to the global aid sector. Hundreds of millions of people facing acute crises are waiting on humanitarian assistance that now will likely never come. So what does the aid system do now? What reforms can help it survive this moment and not only deliver assistance, but also manage its reputation? We have Sonali Korde back on the podcast today. She's the MD Anderson Visiting Fellow at the Baker Institute and former Assistant USAID Administrator and Head of the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. She's also written a brief recently about ways to strengthen the aid sector in light of the present funding cuts. Thanks for listening. Tonight's discussion on the future of international aid, global foreign assistance, is a particularly timely one, given that in the Israeli cabinet session, which is still underway as we meet here tonight, approval is expected to be given for the first phase of the 20-point Gaza deal. Now, one of the key elements in that first phase, beyond hostage release and the introduction of a ceasefire with an initial Israeli withdrawal, is the reopening of Gaza to the provision of humanitarian assistance. And that assistance is going to be delivered through classic international and possibly bilateral, which means national means, into Gaza. All of this requires structure. It requires professionals to do the deliveries, and it requires, of course, financing. And we're going to be talking about what the future is for assistance tonight. Sonali is ideally suited to be a commentator on this issue. She's also written a recent detailed policy brief on this question of the future of international assistance, foreign assistance, not just from the United States. So with thanks to all of you, and thank you, Sonali, for being here with us tonight, I'm going to launch into the questions. The cut the administration has made through a variety of legislative and non-legislative means of $8 billion in the USAID account, that is the appropriated account that was present for the previous fiscal year, it's a hard number to comprehend. Can you put that number in context of overall typical USAID, U.S. foreign assistance, and what are the consequences of a cut like this?
Thanks for having me here. It's great to be back and discuss these issues. The cut is enormous, and the consequences are being felt every day on the ground. There's been some great journalistic work done on really documenting the real world, real life impacts on people living in places like Sudan and Darfur. There's been some recent work done on the impact of cuts in Burma, around the world, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And a lot of these are places that don't always make the headlines every day, but the impacts are real. The impact of the cuts were compounded by 2 other factors. One was the speed. So there was no runway really time-wise to transition, find other means of funding, work with the communities to prepare them for the cuts. They really did happen overnight, and that was tough to deal with for people working on the ground. The third thing I should say is it was not only the United States. The UK made very drastic cuts, and we see a lot of the European countries also have made cuts in the sector. So all of these things combined sent real shockwaves through the system and had shockwaves on the ground.
Sonali, a question I've often had to ask myself. $8 billion. What was the total volume of the previous fiscal year's pre-cut, pre-January 20th AID budget?
That is an excellent question, and the number is not coming to me at the top of my head. I want to say that the foreign assistance part of what we used to term as the USAID partially and fully managed assistance, and this is excluding security sector assistance, I want to say was somewhere between $27 and $30 billion a year, but I am recalling that from deep memory.
And how much of that money remains now with the Department of State for theoretical expenditure?
So that is also a hard number to calculate at the moment because the funding was subject to rescissions and some of that money expired, and a lot of this is getting tested in the courts as we speak.
But in theory, state will administer what remains of what was USAID's assistance budget that is still extant, hasn't expired, hasn't been lost through rescission. Correct?
Yes, whatever is remaining would be managed by the Department of State, and we'll have to see how it plays out. Definitely, the lost rescission is in the court system as we speak. There is a government shutdown as well, so we'll have to see what that impact is. And the Congress is still working on 26 bills. So the House 26 bill restored some of the cuts that were made by the administration, surprisingly, but also positively. And we don't know what the Senate will do, but it's still a long process ahead of us.
I would note analytically, the common wisdom, which could be wrong, is that when this reaches the Supreme Court, the court is most unlikely to rule that the president doesn't have the authority to conduct these so-called pocket rescissions that are submitted at the very end of the fiscal year and the monies go away. It could go another direction, but very few analysts think the court will determine that if the Congress does not protest this action, this infringement on its rights, it is no role for the courts, for the judicial system to do so. So the idea that this is restored is most unlikely. But let's go to consequences, Sonali. You've talked about areas of desperate need. Sudan certainly is one of the most prominent of those, exceeding even Gaza in terms of the magnitude of the human suffering and deprivation. What about the political consequences for the United States of simply not being in the space as we were, of leading or being a major contributor to foreign assistance?
So that is a very important issue. And as I was writing the paper, the method for writing the paper was I interviewed key informants to really ask and tease out some of these questions, really across the board, across the political spectrum. And one issue, which is exactly what you're talking about, is the concept of humanitarian diplomacy. And humanitarian diplomacy really specifically refers to diplomacy to obtain access for humanitarian purposes in conflict zones and areas that are blocked off. And this has been an American tradition since at least the time of President Reagan, but going back much further in history, where the United States has played a traditional role in negotiating access for humanitarian purposes, not just the financing and the provision of aid, but the actual diplomatic negotiations to open up corridors or manage aid and aid workers going cross-line, cross warring parties. And the U.S. has done this for years. So President Reagan had played a very prominent role, for example, in Ethiopia. Successive presidents have done this, whether for Syria, whether for Sudan, the list goes on and on. But there's a real question mark now because not only has the funding dried up, but the people have dried up, and whether there is a will of this current administration to play that leadership role. The humanitarian community, especially some senior leaders in the NGO, the UN, and former UN officials, are concerned about a vacuum in this diplomacy and this leadership. And it's been noted by several people that really the U.S. was the strongest voice in playing this role going back for decades. And there's been a presumption that perhaps, for example, the UN could play this role. And the truth is that the UN has a lot of legal constraints that prevents it from effectively playing that role in the manner that the United States has done so in the past. So for example, some of you may be familiar with the example of Syria and the crossings from Turkey into Syria. The UN's rules required it to get Security Council resolution. A lot of that was negotiated by the United States. Last year, a key crossing from Chad into Sudan was shut down, and the UN, per its own legal rules, did not use that Adre crossing, even though really there was nobody there at the border that would have stopped them.
This is to say the U.S. can unilaterally move assistance as it wishes and as it deems secure and accountable. But for the UN to do this, it requires explicit authorizations, often from the very regimes controlling the physical crossing in conflict with internal elements or external elements.
Exactly. So therein lies a question mark as to whether another country or set of countries will step into this space, or perhaps the administration itself might step into this space as well, perhaps with humanitarian access issues as part of a peace negotiation. And, we see some signs of this right now with the deal that was just negotiated on Gaza, which includes humanitarian elements.
Sonali, how have U.S. adversaries? Russia's not in this space at all. Russia does not provide humanitarian assistance to anyone, never has. But China certainly does, under various guises. It builds, it constructs, it does a number of civic or infrastructure-related projects in countries around the world. What's the consequences of the U.S. ceding place to an aggressive China?
So the consequences are felt, every single day overseas. One is very simply that the people who used to do the development work overseas are not really there with an American flag because those folks have been cut in numbers. Another area that you will see PRC exert influence is in the United Nations and international organizations. The U.S., you would know best, Ambassador Satterfield, but the State Department had an entire department that used to work hard to place Americans in different UN agencies and UN positions and international organizations. That office has, I think, suffered from some reductions in staff most recently. And, I think our ambassadors every single day overseas are playing a bit of a real world competition with the Chinese ambassadors to gain influence and the attention of host country governments and stakeholders. And I think that a tool that used to be a powerful one for ambassadors is definitely not quite there in the same strength.
Let me pick up from that tool for ambassadors. One of the arguments put forward by the present administration is that USAID was in fundamental conflict with chiefs of mission, with ambassadors, with the Department of State in terms of the policies which USAID, as a separate agency, often given cabinet status by presidents at the start of administrations, was providing. And I'll simply comment here, having been chief of mission in 4 different posts, 2 of which had the largest assistance missions in the world, Cairo and Baghdad. Yes, there was always a dialogue with the USAID mission director over specific programs, what were the outcomes, what were they generating in terms of long-term strategic gains for things that were important to the U.S. And those could be things like training students for jobs that were available in their countries. That is, providing funding for teachers for education, but not simply throwing the money out there. Educating for jobs where we knew the vacancies existed and where the country had buy-in for the programs we were running. Or putting in water treatment programs for non-potable water-served communities, which were of a character devised by AID's own people, their researchers and scientists, to be maintainable indefinitely by local villagers. They didn't require massive external investment or technicians to keep them operating. They could be done locally. So we would talk about this, but I have never in my 44-year career seen an example where AID was pursuing a policy at variance with that of the Secretary of State or the President or the National Security Advisor. I don't know where this allegation comes from, but never in my experience have I seen it. And I can assure you, were there to be such a circumstance, the aid mission director would not long survive their tenure at a post. The ambassador is the president's representative in country. But you made reference, and for this audience, I think it's important to note, Sonali, people aren't there. And that's literally true. No one is there unless they have been rehatted into the Department of State in small numbers to manage what remains of the aid budget. And this is in the thousands of direct hire Americans, as well as our locally employed staff. And you know better than I do how many of those local staff have been with the U.S. government for decades. And their entree, their access, their ability to deal with all parts of the political spectrum in their countries are almost non-reproducible. And when you lose them, when they've been riffed, they don't come back. They go on to other jobs. They do other things. You can't just turn a switch in 3 years and bring back thousands of employees at, by the way, very considerable severance and contract expense to the U.S. government. This elimination of AID isn't cheap. There is a huge bill that's being paid for all of this to settle out contractual arrangements, program arrangements, and people, human beings. So Sonali would turn to the question of why. Political support for U.S. foreign aid spending has been declining for several years now, particularly but not entirely exclusively among Republicans. What factors have driven this, do you think?
So this is frankly, an existential question for the future of foreign assistance. And those of us who were, I think, both at State Department and USAID, perhaps took it for granted that we believed we had bipartisan support. And I specifically asked the question around humanitarian assistance, since that was the focus of my paper. But I did have the opportunity to interview several colleagues and contacts who are on the conservative side of the political spectrum. And it was a simple question like, wait, what went wrong? I mean, the year before, you gave us $10 billion of supplemental funding for humanitarian assistance, but we came under some scrutiny and attack, and we went from 10 to 0 and the entire decimation of the industry. So obviously something has happened here, and we did not get a strong show of support from the right side. And I had to ask why, what happened? And the answers were quite telling. And the response I got was, well, for one thing, there's a perception. And I'm talking here now about perception. I'm certainly not talking about my own view, which I will remain silent about. But there is perceptions that humanitarian community started to do things that were considered controversial or had political opposition, whether it was around supporting and spending on climate change or gender diversity issues or around DEIA issues. So there was that set of perceptions. There was a set of perceptions that the community lost within the humanitarian world. We have a phrase, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. There was a sense that the community lost neutrality, impartiality, and independence. And in its quest to speak out vocally on the Gaza war, there was a perception that the community spoke out only against Israel without calling equal attention or due attention to Hamas, for example. That perception was there. Another perception was just a perception that these humanitarian crises go on for too long. It's a black hole of money. You don't ever get out of it. How long have we been supporting Syria? How long have we been supporting Sudan? It's just kind of a money drain and the problems are never solved. That was another perception. Another perception was just around that there's no support for it. The community's lost its ability to speak plainly and have grassroots support. So I think there was a whole sort of series of issues that led to silence when all of this happened. And I think it has a real consequence and a real lesson that needs to be taken going forward in the future.
That said, and I was with Congressman Dan Crenshaw 2 weeks ago, and we were talking about a variety of issues, but he spoke very eloquently saying, a constituent comes to me and says, we're spending billions of dollars on Sudan, on some program feeding, doing something somewhere, and I've got potholes in my street, or my bridge is deteriorating. What are you going to do about it? And he says, and do you know what every one of us, Democrat or Republican, do? We say, of course, that money needs to go to focus on your potholes. He says, well, nothing ever goes to the potholes. But it also doesn't generate in those face-to-face constituency meetings great support for the external programs. It's not that they're going to take money away from Sudan and put it into potholes. Indeed, there wasn't enough money in the entire foreign assistance budget to manage Houston's pothole situation. You can make a vague start at it, but it would take far more money than $30 billion to deal with that. But his point was, if there isn't leadership at the level of congressional leaders and the president to explain why this money is important, you're not going to get it. Don't look to individual members or senators to defend it on the ground. Marco Rubio was a strong defender of foreign assistance up until the moment that he was appointed Secretary of State, when things seemed to have changed. But Sonali, where do we go? What's happened has happened, and the clock may or may not, my guess is, it won't ever go back to the way that it was. To imagine a reconstruction of USAID as it was, I think, is fantastical. But what should be done now? What are the tactical tools needed, or strategic tools needed, to rebuild support for cogent, sustainable U.S. engagement, popularly supported engagement in humanitarian assistance?
Sure. So I think there's 3 or 4 themes here that I was able to tease out in the course of my reading and conversation. So first is just that the community has to restore confidence with respect to not just the donors, but with respect to its constituents. So whether constituents meaning the American people, in our case here in the US, but if you're in the UK or somewhere else in Europe, those humanitarians also need to make the case to their communities. So sometimes there's a perception, there are scandals that happen in the humanitarian community, whether it's corruption or abuse that have engendered issues within the community. The humanitarians have to make smart cuts. There was a lot of money in the system for some period of time because the Congress had been very generous. And that basically meant that the community was able to do things like conferences, for example, or hire a lot of headquarters staff, or write a lot of reports and put out a lot of glossies. Well, I think some of that stuff probably has to get pared down, but what shouldn't get pared down are the people who know how to do the work in the field and the hard places. So that's a hard balance to strike, but trying to make sure that the core life-saving work still happens has to be a priority, and organizations have to show how they're doing that. I think another issue, or sort of how do we rebuild, has to do with external messaging. I'm from the community, so I'm criticizing myself as well. But the external messaging, I think, really falls flat. There's too much jargon. We don't always do a good job of explaining what we're doing. Going back to your point on money, yes, in the absolute, it may have been billions of dollars, but when you compare that amount of spending to your overall tax dollars, it's still less than 1 cent of your tax dollar. And Americans are extremely generous people. Anytime there's a disaster, we used to get phone calls all the time. Hey, I want to donate to this disaster or that disaster, and where should we put it? Americans are so fundamentally generous. And so I think when we connect with, wait, it's just a tiny amount of money, or this is what you are doing for a community, and you speak plainly, it can resonate. But I think the messaging from the community has turned into a bit of a guilt, like the world is suffering and it's Western countries' fault. Well, that's probably not going to resonate at this moment. No one in this room is at fault for what's happening in Darfur. So that's probably not the best messaging to use, for example. But I think that the messaging, which connects at a very sort of human, personal level, gives people ways to engage, It doesn't always have to be about money. It can be about calling your member of Congress to say this is important. It can basically be about inviting somebody into your churches and schools to talk about what happens and what we do and what the world looks like. It could be as simple as just getting National Geographic for your kids so that they learn and have an awareness of the world around them. All of these things matter. And I think we have to acknowledge that they matter and not just say, well, it's all about money and it's all about guilt. And then the last point is around coalition building. And the community, as we talked about, seems to have maybe, without even realizing it, lost a constituency on the conservative side, on the right side. That has to be rebuilt because the only way this work is going to survive is to have a bipartisan coalition of support. And here I say that PEPFAR is the model. PEPFAR, back in the days when it was again started by President Bush, was a coalition of the right, the left, the grassroots, the activists, the faith-based communities across faiths. It was really an incredible coalition that came together, landmark legislation that was passed on an overwhelmingly bipartisan basis. And PEPFAR is the funding that survived the rescissions. So all these years later, that coalition still holds together for PEPFAR. And the humanitarians need to build it. And it has to be built kind of ground up and frankly from scratch, because we can't just basically be talking to one side. We really have to do the hard work to build that coalition. And it has to be completely politically neutral and about humans and connections and getting the work done.
Sonali, I have a very hard question. It's one to which I have no definite answer. But whether it's expressed this way or is implicit in the critique of foreign assistance is the following. X millions, hundreds of millions, whatever the figure is of dollars, have been spent for fill in the country or regional blanks. Sudan, Somalia, you can choose any number of countries, to simply feed or provide medicine for X population, children, adults, nursing mothers. We were doing this 30 years ago. There is no reason to anticipate we won't be doing it 30 years from now. Why is the U.S. spending any tax dollars on palliative care for terminally ill or life support societies, economies, which cheerfully disregard their own populations, kill and brutalize them over decades, indeed their national histories? What's the U.S. obligation to keep pouring money into what? Not teaching people to fish, but giving them fish forever. Why should we do this? I'm exaggerating, but this is behind a lot of the critique.
Look, I think that's a very hard question, and I will offer a tough critique back, which is that protracted crises that go on this long are frankly somewhat a failure of global diplomacy. These crises, the ones that you mentioned, Sudan, Somalia, Syria, are countries that have been at conflict for a very long time, and the diplomatic efforts to end those conflicts have repeatedly failed. And humanitarian assistance in these situations are sort of a salve to kind of take care of the population while these failures keep happening. It's rare that after a natural disaster, you will see that same level of humanitarian assistance go in. People do generally recover and get back on their feet. But the places you're talking about are the places that are chronically failed states. This is the Sahel. It's the same place. These countries have basically dealt with like terrorism and war and conflict. All of these places are because, yes, their governments have failed, but regional and global diplomatic efforts have also failed. There's always a little bit of a classic kind of butting of heads between the diplomats and the humanitarians, where the Even, the diplomats might say, can't you just take care of these people? And the humanitarians will say, well, can't you just stop this war? So that's how I'd respond, because I think that diplomacy is hard. It has costs. And sometimes, there is a little bit of an implicit, well, if you just kind of keep the humanitarian stuff going, maybe we don't have to make the hard diplomatic choices.
Is there a moral obligation for the United States as a government to provide this assistance?
I think so, in my opinion, yes.
Interesting to see, and I haven't, what polling would reveal about just that question. Put aside strategy, tactics, vacuums formed, U.S. hard, soft power. Is there a moral obligation on the part of the U.S. as the country that it is to provide this? And do we lose something in not carrying out this mission? Has a price tag, but there's a price tag to not doing it as well. And it's beyond measurable strategic gain. It's the image of what Ronald Reagan described as the shining city on the hill, which wasn't, although it's been misinterpreted, intended to be, oh, there's the U.S. sitting up there on a pedestal. It's no, if you're a shining city on a hill, you had better be very careful about what you do, because everyone is looking at you. You've got to be sure your conduct is appropriate given the attention that you draw.
I think there's a saying, which I'm sure I'm going to get wrong, but my personal view, and this is how I still think of America and my country, is, to those who much has been given, much is also owed. And I think that's who we are as a nation. That's what I still believe.
This has been Baker Briefing, where we make news make sense. The podcast is brought to you by Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, which delivers nonpartisan policy research on the most pressing issues facing the United States, Texas, and the world. Share your feedback and your guest or topic suggestions at bakerbriefing@rice.edu. This episode was produced by Corinna Zemel with support from Grayson Beaubien. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Learn more about our work at bakerinstitute.org, and thank you for listening.